Hello and welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, a journal that's been talking about religious freedom for the past 120 years. And I'm here together with my co-host, Alan Reinach, who is president of the Church State Council and someone who has been litigating issues of religious freedom for almost 4 decades now. I am excited today to interview someone who I have been listening to for years, and that is Jeffrey Rosen. He is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Now, if you've ever visited Philadelphia, you will have seen the National Constitution Center right there on Independence Mall. And it acts as not only a museum of our founding era, but also as an archive of a lot of material about constitutional issues, and also a place where ongoing conversations take place on pressing issues of constitutional interpretation. Fascinating place. I'd encourage you to visit it. Our guest, Mr. Rosen, has been leading that institution since, I believe, 2013. And, he comes from a very interesting background. He was a journalist. He was one of the most widely read legal commentators in America. He wrote for a number of prestigious journals. And then he made the transition to the National Constitution Center. And he is now barred by the terms that Congress set down when it established this center. He's barred from holding opinions about political things. He must be strictly nonpartisan. But I'm only sorry in this interview that Alan did not get the chance to participate. Unfortunately, the timing didn't work out. But let's roll straight into this conversation with Jeffrey Rosen. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
And congratulations on this wonderful new book. It truly is an insight into the founding generation. We live in such uniquely polarized times. I actually found it perversely somewhat comforting to read about times when we did have such differences between us, even back to the time of Jefferson and Hamilton. So why don't you take us through what the core of their disagreement was and on the disagreement on which your book is based?
I'm so glad that you found the book comforting, and I did too, to learn about our history deeply, to recognize how profound those early disagreements were, and to see that despite those disagreements, the leaders of the competing parties, Hamilton and Jefferson, ultimately respected each other and were committed to civil dialogue. It does give us hope in these challenging times. The core disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson was about the scope of federal power. Hamilton wanted to construe federal power broadly in favor of the federal government. Jefferson wanted to construe it strictly on behalf of the states. This led to different interpretations of the Constitution. Hamilton favors what he called liberal construction and Jefferson strict construction. And it also led to disagreements about the biggest policy issues at the time of the framing, in particular, how powerful the president should be, whether or not Congress could charter a national bank, and whether or not the president could suppress free speech. I can keep going, but that's the basic disagreement. And it's so striking that those same disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson over the scope of national power versus strict states' rights and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution have persisted throughout American history.
As I read your book, it seemed to me that even though they had these profound disagreements, they had a shared fear or horror of an American Caesar. And maybe even both a sneaking suspicion that the Republic really wasn't on solid ground. So how far did that play into their respective approaches?
You're so right. And I begin the book, as you know, with that dinner party that defined America, where both Hamilton and Jefferson are gathered because Washington's away, Hamilton says to Jefferson, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" Jefferson says, "They're my three heroes, the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." Hamilton pauses and then blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson scribbles in his diary that evening, "This proves that Hamilton is for a monarchy bottomed on corruption." And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to the supposed Caesaristic ambitions of the Hamiltonian Party, which Jefferson calls the monocrats. And it's such a striking scene because Hamilton was almost certainly joking, because as you say, he feared Caesar as much as Jefferson. He writes in the Federalist Papers, imagine that Shays' Rebellion, which was the riot in Western Massachusetts that led to the calling of the Constitutional Convention, imagine that Shays' Rebellion had been led by a Caesar or a Catiline, says Hamilton. The Republic would have fallen. And he's afraid of a Caesar who will flatter the mob from below and persuade the people to surrender their liberty in exchange for cheap luxuries and surrender liberty. Jefferson fears a Caesar from above who will subvert elections and establish himself as a dictator for life. And that's why it's so striking that both Hamilton and Jefferson converge in thinking they found a crypto Caesar, as Hamilton puts it, in Aaron Burr. And it's so significant. The reason that Hamilton ultimately dies in the duel is because he favored Jefferson over Burr in the election of 1800, and he was not a fan of Jefferson. This is his mortal political enemy, but he thinks that Jefferson is a patriot, whereas Burr is a traitor who wants to establish himself as a permanent dictator in Mexico. And later, uh, evidence at Burr's treason trial suggests Hamilton was right to worry, because Burr offered his services to the British ambassador in exchange for leading an independent secessionist republic. And there's evidence at the trial that Burr says hang Jefferson and wants to march on Washington. So Hamilton was right to worry. And for the rest of American history, Burr is the model, the antitype, the cautionary tale of the aspiring crypto Caesar who both Hamilton and Jefferson feared, and those fears have persisted up till today.
You know, it struck me also as I was reading your book, just how malleable Jefferson's rhetoric has been, as opposed to Hamilton's, right? Because Jefferson's vision seems to have been co-opted at different times throughout our history by folks who have diametrically opposing agendas, policy agendas, and so Jefferson's vision has sort of served that purpose of sort of being everything to every person. Is that a fair summation?
That's a perfect summation. There's a great book by the Jefferson scholar Merrill Peterson, who calls Jefferson a protean figure. In other words, he can be adapted to really any position you like. And that's exactly what happened throughout American history. As you said, first, the Jefferson of limited government is the hero of the early Democratic Party, and then he's taken over by the Southern secessionists who like his limited government rhetoric, but reject his statement that all men are created equal, and they call the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie. And then, in one of the great acts of political chutzpah, is the only word for it in history, Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s reinvents the Democratic Party as the party of Jeffersonian democracy rather than limited government. And he goes on to expand the federal government beyond limits that even Hamilton could have hoped for, all the same time that he's building the Jefferson Memorial and putting Jefferson on the nickel and calling himself the second coming of Thomas Jefferson. And then it's so significant that Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party in the 1960s because it had abandoned the limited government principles of Jefferson, and he reinvents the modern Republicans as the party of limited government. So all this suggests that Jefferson is indeed a malleable figure. People pick and choose from different strands of his legacy according to the policies of the moment, but it also makes him inescapable.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, coming to today, if Jefferson or Hamilton were able to take a look around the American Republic that they helped create, what would they recognize as functioning more or less in line with what they envisioned? What would really surprise them? What would horrify them?
Great question. I'm going to be I'm going to have some humility in answering it, because when you see how people throughout history have insisted that Jefferson and Hamilton would have seen things the way they did, you know, Who knows exactly what they would have thought. But let's go back to, kind of civics 101. I think it's fair to say that both Jefferson and Hamilton would have been surprised at the current failure of checks and balances. Both anticipated that Congress would be the most dangerous branch, to use Madison's words, that would suck all power into its impetuous vortex. And although they disagreed about how powerful the presidency should be, both saw the president as a constrained office, a sort of chief magistrate who would execute the laws passed by Congress. And they saw the judiciary as the least dangerous branch, as Hamilton put it, having neither purse nor sword. Again, disagreeing in each case about precisely how powerful the judiciary should be. Jefferson is a complete opponent of federal judicial power and wants to deny the federal courts the power to even review state court decisions. He fears a strong executive, except when he becomes president himself, at which point he completely reverses his position and doubles the size of Louisiana and champions the executive power he previously denounced. But broadly, the sketch I gave was embraced by both of them and by all members of the founding generation. Congress is going to legislate, the president will execute, and the judiciary will interpret the law, but with a very light hand. Today, trying to be as descriptive here as possible, Congress has stopped exercising its checking power, and Congresses refused to check presidents of their own parties and have delegated vast swaths of administrative authority to the executive ever since the New Deal period. And in fact, starting in the progressive era, the presidency has swelled to imperial degrees, to use Arthur Schlesinger's phrase, and is asserting an ability to communicate directly with the people that started in the progressive era with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and is increasingly using executive orders to achieve by fiat what it can't achieve from a polarized Congress. And the judiciary has become very aggressive in striking down laws passed by Congress and the states, and more recently embracing a very broad view of executive power that arguably goes far beyond what Hamilton himself anticipated. So for all those reasons, I'm not sure they would have been happy about separation of powers, but of course they weren't all that happy in their lifetimes either, and neither was sure that the republic would succeed. Hamilton feared the president wasn't strong enough to check democratic mobs in the states, and he feared that democracy was the greatest threat, as he said on the day before he died. And Jefferson feared and a crypto aristocracy that would conspire with the president to establish a kind of Caesarism in America and rule by fiat from above. So, because of their uncertainty about whether the republic would succeed, that I don't know whether who wouldn't be surprised 200 years later. It's impossible not to be surprised, but they wouldn't be. The fact that the future of the republic was uncertain would not have come to them as something that was unfamiliar.
So, slightly off topic here, just listening as you're talking, the Supreme Court's current focus on originalism, and I'm trying to get down and excavate the original public meaning or the original intent of the founders. Is it even a feasible project, given the fact that sort of right from the beginning there was, competing constitutional visions?
This is just the question that I was able to ask Justice Amy Coney Barrett about last night at the National Constitution Center, because her new book is both a defense of originalism and a description of why she is an originalist. And strikingly, she acknowledged, and she does in her book, that there has been fundamental disagreement about the meaning of the text since the beginning. And she notes on her own the Hamilton-Jefferson debate over the bank as an example of the fundamental disagreement between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution. And she also acknowledges that early originalists like her former boss, Justice Scalia, had defended originalism as a means of constraining judicial discretion and deferring to democratic outcomes. And she acknowledges that it hasn't done that originalists can be quite aggressive in striking down laws, and also that because you can make historical arguments on both sides of any case. Originalism doesn't necessarily constrain judges all that much. But she says she's an originalist because she thinks that the text is law, and her job as a judge is to interpret the text. And I thought that was a very candid defense of originalism.
It is. It's actually quite refreshing. Um, so, speaking of what's actually explicitly in the law, I think people were surprised, have been surprised that there are not as many guardrails on executive power explicitly in the Constitution, that a lot of this, it seems, rests more on norms or on, even the personal characteristics of the office holder. How far in throughout our history has that role of the executive been shaped and restrained by un in things that are not explicit in the Constitution?
There's a reason that the founders said that the republic could only survive if our leaders had virtue. Their model, of course, is George Washington, the greatest man of his age, because he's the most self-composed, the most self-mastered. He masters his temper, and at a time of rebellion in Newburgh, he appeals to the troops for prudence and temperance, all the classical virtues. That's why the founders think personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. This isn't some feel-good civics lessons. They really think that unless our leaders are self-disciplined and self-mastered and put the public interest above their own selfish, partisan, or egoistic interests, then they're going to try to turn themselves into Caesar, the way every unconstrained leader has done in all of history. So we've been, you can say we've been fortunate in American history in not having leaders too often who are attacked as crypto Caesar, although some of our greatest presidents, including Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, were attacked as Caesar. It's really striking. Actually, this was in Justice in Akil Amar's book, Interview to Kill, at the Constitution Center the night before last. He notes that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, he had appeared in a performance of Julius Caesar a couple days before, and he exclaims "Sic semper tyrannis," which is from supposed to have been exclaimed by Brutus right before he assassinated Caesar. So the idea of bringing down Lincoln as a Caesar was explicit in Booth's deranged imagination. And then FDR is attacked as Caesar and dresses up like Julius Caesar at his birthday party in 1934 and wears a wreath crown, and Eleanor dresses up like a Roman matron, and they're kind of making fun of the charges, but he's very much in the same vein. But broadly, our leaders have respected democratic norms. They've not tried to install themselves as dictators for life. Um, and now, of course, we're having the same debate today.
In your book, you write that there's always been a strain of American illiberalism, and recent events show that even on both sides of the political spectrum, there is more of an expression of illiberal ideas. What is fueling this bent toward illiberalism, and what does history teach us about dealing with it?
What is fueling it is passion over reason, is sectarian self-interest, and a rejection of the liberal idea, a spurning of the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, which hold it to be self-evident that all people are created equal and we're endowed by our Creator with natural rights, and we create limited governments to secure those rights, and that when government threatens them, we have the right to alter and abolish it. And we've seen throughout American history illiberal strains on the left and the right, from the mobs who rose up violently against the rule of law in Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, to the Southern defenders of slavery who called it a positive good, like John Calhoun, and rejected the Declaration as a self-evident lie, to the Southern resistance to Reconstruction during the Redemptionist period, where violent mobs lynched African Americans and subverted the rule of law, for the resistance during the Civil Rights era to the Constitution and the rule of law. And of course, we're seeing it today in the epidemic of political violence against leaders on the left and the right by violent extremists who reject the idea that our Constitution requires a rule of reason rather than passion, and the truth can only emerge in in civil dialogue. Historically, you do not want to be on the side of those who are rejecting the liberal idea and calling for the tearing down of the Constitution. In retrospect, they are on the wrong side. They have, disgraced themselves with uh, their rejection of the liberal idea, and it's the same case today.
I am an avid listener of We the People, and one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much is that your enthusiasm for all things constitutional comes through so clearly. And I'm curious as to how you kind of moved in this direction. What drew you to become a scholar of American constitutionalism?
I loved to read and write as a kid, uh, mostly to read. There was nothing else to do, of course, before screens in the car. So on long car rides up to upstate New York, where my folks had a place, I would read so much that when they opened the car door, I would fall out because I didn't listen to the car open. So a lot of wonderful reading, spectacular teachers of English and government. I was an English major in college, and history and literature. Um, Went to law school because I couldn't think of what else to do, but I wanted to keep reading and writing. And in law school, my love of the Constitution was kindled by more great teachers, including Professor Akil Amar, who I had the joy of interviewing the other night. We've remained close friends. And Akil Amar's focused on primary text and on the importance of studying history absolutely kindled my imagination and my love of the Constitution and love of learning. Uh, in law school, I decided I didn't want to be a real lawyer because I thought I wouldn't enjoy it or be good at it. And I decided to be a journalist, which almost led my mother to distraction. After my expensive education, I got a great break right after law school. I'd been a summer intern at the New Republic magazine, and the editor of the New Republic, Andrew Sullivan, to whom I owe my journalistic career, invited me to come back to the magazine as the legal affairs editor at the age of 28, which was a huge break, and I'm incredibly grateful to him for taking a flyer on me. So I was a journalist and a law professor for about 20 years, writing and about the Supreme Court and teaching it. And then out of the blue, the National Constitution Center called in 2013. They were looking for a new head, and I'd never run anything in my life, but they took a flyer on me, and it was like the greatest break of my life. Just, it is such an incredible honor and joy every day to be working with this amazing team at a educational institution created by Congress to inspire people to learn about the Constitution. What could possibly be more inspiring than that? So that's my story, and I'm very lucky.
And what does the National Constitution Center do? What is its mission?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
I thought you would.
It's that, as you know from the We the People podcast, I begin every episode by reciting the charter that Congress created when it chartered the National Constitution Center during the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1988. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the U.S. Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. What an amazing and meaningful mission. And we do that in a couple of important ways. We're the Museum of We the People on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, across from Independence Hall, with the greatest view of Independence Hall in the world. And it's so inspiring to sit in that grand atrium and gaze out on Independence Hall and think about all the light that emerged there. And then to come into the center and enjoy interactive programs, theater, the incredible Signers Hall with statues of the framers, and amazing new exhibits, including the one we're about to open at the beginning of 2026, a new Founding Principles Gallery and Separation of Powers Gallery that will display rare copies of the Constitution and founding documents, and it's just going to be incredible. So it's a amazing museum in Philadelphia In addition, it's a national education platform, America's leading educational platform for nonpartisan constitutional education. Your listeners and viewers can check it out at the Interactive Constitution at constitutioncenter.org. When we launched the Interactive Constitution in 2015, we brought together America's leading liberal and conservative scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. For example, as I noted last night, Justice Barrett, who was then a law professor, joined Neil Katyal in writing 1,000 words about the habeas corpus clause and then separate statements about what they disagree about. Multiply that by 80 clauses, 160 scholars. It's an extraordinary modeling of civil dialogue among America's leading constitutional thinkers. It's now gotten almost 100 million hits since we launched in 2015. It's among the most Googled constitutions in the world, showing the deep hunger in America for nonpartisan constitutional education. And then now's the point in the answer where I always feel like a Ginsu knives salesman saying, but there's more. We have online classes on the Constitution, Constitution 101, on our website and in collaboration with Khan Academy, so learners of all ages can learn the basics of the Constitution. And just yesterday, we launched a really incredible interactive Declaration of Independence, where we did for the Declaration what we'd previously done for the Constitution, convening America's greatest historians to write about the big ideas of the Declaration. Robbie George on liberty, Gordon Wood on government by consent, Danielle Allen on equality. Akil Amar annotated the whole Declaration clause by clause. There are biographies of the signers, and there are questions for teachers and kids and for adult reading groups and for parents to talk about with their uh, with their kids in their communities. And we're hoping that it'll be a kind of core curriculum for America 250 that will inspire conversations about the Constitution throughout the anniversary year and beyond. So that is some of what the National Constitution Center does.
It's an incredible resource. And, I know from personal experience going to your website, I'm always stunned by the quality and depth of resources there. We're running out of time. I just want to sneak in one last question. You mentioned the 250th anniversary of the Declaration coming up next year. As you look ahead, are you personally pessimistic or optimistic about the future health of the great American experiment?
In this very meaningful job I'm lucky enough to have, I'm not allowed to have any political opinions at all, which is extremely liberating. I'm very lucky. First of all, I've lost interest in my own opinions. And I had a lot of them when I was a journalist, but really, who cares what I think, including me? And also, my opinions are not worth anything more than anyone else's. And I don't know what the future will bring in terms of the fate of the republic. That's a matter of fortune and fate and providence, and it can turn on small choices that are now unknown. But I am optimistic about the future of civil dialogue uh, and deep learning about the Constitution and about the attachment of Americans of different perspectives to the American idea. I'm fortunate enough to travel around the country and to see how deeply Americans in red and blue states embrace the meaning of the Declaration and the Constitution, even though they disagree about how to apply it in particular circumstances. And just my experience is if you have convenings where you're not allowed to talk about politics, which is just a great ground rule because we're not going to agree about politics in these polarized times, but instead people are encouraged to dig deep on American history and the Constitution, you can have civil, meaningful dialogue, exploring agreement and disagreement, but always united by this love of the Constitution and love of America. So in that sense, I'm optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for your time. And thank you for your new book. It's just wonderful. And I wish you all the best with the National Constitution Center. And I'll continue listening to We the People.
Thank you for reading the book so closely and for keeping on listening. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks. So, Alan, I really enjoyed this interview with Jeffrey Rosen. I don't know about you, but I often listen to his podcast, We the People, which has the most amazing conversations about issues of constitutional interpretation that you will find anywhere. And he often gets people from different perspectives to come together and just have a civil dialogue. And it's just so refreshing to see that sort of agreeable disagreement in action. So that's why I really enjoyed talking to Jeffrey Rosen. And what struck me most, I'm sorry that you weren't able to make this interview, Alan, but what struck me most about the conversation I had with him was the fact that, what goes around comes around. These issues, these big issues of states' rights versus federal power, which were right there at in the founding generation, which drove a lot of the political conflict of the time. We're seeing iterations of that today. You know,
No question. No
yeah,
question. Look, the irony of today, of course, the new religious right going back to, the late 70s and early 80s in the days of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, you know, they came out of a staunch states' rights, anti-federal power movement
a
that was
Jeffersonian movement, right?
right, that was threatening the tax exempt status of the explosive number of Christian schools that were racially segregated following Brown versus Board and the use of federal power, in Little Rock and other places to integrate public schools, right? So you had this federal state dimension to the dismantling of Jim Crow and the whole post Civil War, post Reconstruction social structure of race relations, particularly in the South, right? So you have this movement predicated on opposing federal power until they get power. And now that, the movement supports, you know, um, the president, frankly, there is no restriction on federal power that they're, willing to endorse, right? They're taking a maximalist view of of federal and particularly executive power.
Absolutely. I mean, it reflects also how different political factions treat free speech. Everyone's a free speech absolutist when they're in the minority. They don't hold power. But once they have power, all of a sudden they see these lovely, attractive levers of power that they can pull to suppress the
Right.
speech of political opponents. And wow, they're very tempting.
Well,
So it's human nature.
I
Let
I I keep reminding, listeners about Anthony Lewis's great book years ago, Freedom for the Thought We Hate.
Okay,
Uh,
I'm not familiar with that book, so tell me about
well,
it.
he was famously a New York Times columnist, but before that, he was Richard Nixon's speechwriter. So he's
Oh,
not exactly a flaming liberal, but definitely. I mean, this was the story of, and it's been a long time since I've read it, but the story of a number of key free speech cases and incidents involving very unpopular speech, like. I mean, our listeners may not even have any awareness of the time that the ACLU defended the right of Nazis to have a march in a Jewish neighborhood, a suburb of Chicago, Skokie,
uh-huh.
Illinois. Very, very controversial thing. And, defending free speech for the speech that we hate. And it's a fascinating read. But yeah, I mean, we all want free speech for ourselves. The issue is, are we going to extend it to the other guy?
And this was, I think, one of the main themes in my conversation with Jeff, and that was that we desperately need civics education in this country because the ignorance that many of us have of what our constitutional rights are and why it is important that they not be eroded, that ignorance is being exploited. And w- I think that is sort of the ground zero of all that we're trying to do on this podcast as well, Alan. The fact that people need to understand what a constitutional regime republic looks like in practice, and why doing something like dealing with someone's uncomfortable speech and not trying to suppress it, that's just part of living in a constitutional republic.
Well, and I think one thing we're going to have to turn to more in the future, Bettina, is the tremendous imperfection and hypocrisy of our founding document, which on the
Yeah.
one hand,
Yeah.
the Declaration speaks of all men being created equal. And, you know, the choice of the male gender in that sentence turned out to be rather not inclusive, right? Because it wasn't just blacks or Native Americans who didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have the right to vote. Poor white men didn't have the right to vote. So the implementation of any sort of equality,
Yeah.
I want to say it was 1919 or 20 before women's suffrage was enacted.
1920 was the year, Alan.
And it was almost, 60 years after the amendment that gave blacks the right to vote. But even at that time, giving women the right to vote was being advocated in the 1860s. But the powers that be said that was just a bridge too far, and they wouldn't go there. So,
You know, Alan, I think we're falling into a habit after we have our conversation following the interview, we seem to come up with new topics that we need to address.
okay then. Well,
That's one we need to address.
onwards and upwards.
Onwards and upwards. And on that note, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Just Liberty. I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reinach. And remember, eternal vigilance is always the price of liberty.